Hi, welcome to Listening to First Nations Voices podcast. I am Daniel and I am your host again for today. First, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people whose land we are on today, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present. So if you watched the last episode of the podcast, we interviewed Marina Martinello, and she helped explain to us about the Indigenising the curriculum program here at the University of Canberra. So after that, we did a survey, and we got many responses back, and now we have one of the people who answered the survey in the studio with us today. So Janaea, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So first I'd like to ask is that, so most people who answered the survey haven't heard of this Indigenising the curriculum program. So is it surprising that not many people have heard of it, and why do you think that's the case?
I don't think it is surprising, just because I feel like that the Indigenous culture isn't taught to many people when they're younger unless they choose to take it up, like I did. I'm Indigenous, obviously, but I didn't know the full history till I was older in high school, and the only reason why I knew that is because I took on Aboriginal studies, so it really doesn't surprise me, to be honest.
So what you're saying, it's not mainstream, it's still a niche sort of subject?
Yeah, I feel like it's very still taboo, I suppose, to teach to kids in even high school, because a lot of people are taught from a young age that Captain Cook came here and then that's it. They're not really taught the dark history of it all, which is kind of disappointing because it leads to a lot of misinformation and miseducation, and to the racism and discrimination in this country as well.
So all the Indigenous students who did answer the survey claimed that the University of Canberra doesn't have enough Indigenous content in the units. So why do you think this is the problem?
I feel like that it's usually to teach Indigenous content in certain subjects. It's there to tick a box. It's not actually there to inform the students and to give them the correct information and to allow them to understand why we have racism and discrimination in this country, mostly because they're kind of scared or don't want to acknowledge the full history, I suppose. So yeah.
So in the survey, you said that the university isn't listening to students in regard to the student needs. Why is that?
I wouldn't be too sure, to be honest. I feel like when it comes to listening to Indigenous students, because I've heard other students say to me we should have something just for Indigenous students, a society just for us. And I've had a friend who actually wanted to get a society going here for Indigenous students, but it never went up and running. It never heard anything from the dean or anything about if we could get funding for it, and we haven't heard if we could meet together or anything like that. So I guess the university should do more for their Indigenous students instead of us having to do it ourselves, maybe. Yeah. So
in the survey, we asked people about what could be done to improve the Indigenous participation at the University of Canberra. So some of the students gave many suggestions, which I want to ask about. One of the students suggested increasing the amount of visible art and culture at UC, such as Ngunnawal language used in signage as an example. What do you think of this?
I think that can really help because people want to know the Indigenous language. They want to educate themselves about it, and I feel like having Indigenous signage of Ngunnawal language would actually help, because then people will be more curious and want to learn more about it. I know for a fact it works because there has been universities I went to that do use Indigenous language, and they have seen an increase of students wanting to learn more about the culture and the language as well.
Another student suggested making Indigenous subjects compulsory for education students specifically. You think this would work?
I feel like having some sort of cultural training will work because I feel like it might re-educate those about Indigenous culture, especially in education, because that is such a vital subject for Indigenous students. And I feel like if you have teachers that learn about the culture and that engage themselves in the culture, it makes the students want to come to school. And I think that would be what you would want, right, is to have more Indigenous kids at school. So yeah, I do think that should be important in any subject, really.
What about more financial support, like subsidies for like uni lodge and all that sort of like stuff?
Yeah, I definitely think that there should be more subsidies for Indigenous students. I feel like that would allow them to see that there is an opportunity to go to university. I know that some Indigenous students don't choose university as an option at all because they feel like they can't afford it. So I feel like maybe having some sort of subsidy for accommodation would help, or even maybe a subsidy for HECS as well would definitely be helpful and would allow Indigenous students to come to university more.
Well, do you think that like subsidies for just poor students in general rather than Indigenous ones could work better instead?
Oh yeah, definitely. I feel like any person should be able to go to university if they want to, and money shouldn't be something that stops them, I suppose. Yeah.
And the one person suggested a social society for Indigenous students, which you said like didn't work out. So how would a social like society work?
I feel like it would work if we had like say funding for events, or even if it wasn't sponsored by the uni, like if we knew that there was an Indigenous support network. Like we go to the Ngunnawal Centre, but like every time you go there you meet one or two people, and then the next day you can meet different people. So I feel like having someone or some sort of committee for social events for specifically Indigenous people would be good, because then you can meet all of them at the same time, I suppose, and you could build the support network from there, because I know that I've only got one or two friends that are Indigenous at this uni, and that's the only people I really know. So yeah.
Do you think there's a bit of a stigma against like forming a social group or something?
No, I wouldn't really. I think it'd be like most clubs here at the university. Everyone has like a club to go to, and I feel like having something specifically for Indigenous students, because Indigenous people have this way of relating to each other because of everything they've gone through, and they've gone through similar things in life. So I feel like having that kind of support network would actually help them socially and would help them with their schooling as well. So yeah.
So you said before that Indigenous students have a way of relating to each other. What do you mean by this?
Well, I know personally, I grew up in like a country town, and there was obviously a small Indigenous community there, and I didn't really felt like I kind of belonged when I was in high school, especially with Indigenous people. But it wasn't until like I went to an Aboriginal studies class, and you meet other students who are Indigenous, like they don't have to be, but yeah, you meet other students who are Indigenous, and you hear like what they've gone through and their struggles. Like, for example, maybe they have, I don't want to sound racist, but they might have like more white friends than Indigenous friends, and they kind of feel like they don't know where exactly they belong, because they might be too white for Indigenous people or too Indigenous for white people, so they kind of feel stuck sometimes. So I feel like I've met other students who have gone through a similar experience as that, and I feel like when you meet other students who go through that, you kind of are like, oh, okay, so I'm not the only one that had a bit of it. Like, that's just an example. But yeah, I feel like Indigenous people growing up in Australia with the racism and discrimination we have also have a shared experience that way as well. And they all kind of feel outcasted at some point in their lives. So I feel like having a society wherever you go, or just knowing any Indigenous person, actually makes you feel a lot more comfortable in your environment, I'm pretty sure.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
So that wraps it up for today's episode. So thank you, Janae, for having on. It was a pleasure.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
And that sums up today's episode of Listening to First Nations Voices podcast. Stay tuned for future episodes.